Hi, this is the second season of I Hope This Message Finds You Well, a podcast on curating. My name is Kris Dittel, and with me is my friend and colleague Eloise Sweetman. In this podcast, we talk to curators about their approach to curating, how they began, and what they love about the profession. Today's episode is with Paul O'Neill.
Paul O'Neill is an Irish curator, artist, writer, and educator. He is the artistic director of Publix, a curatorial agency and event space with a dedicated library and reading room in Helsinki, Finland. Between 2013 to 17, he was director of the graduate program at the Centre for Curatorial Studies, Bard College. He is also the author of Culture of Curating and the Curating of Culture, published by MIT Press, among other influential publications on curating.
Well, the first question is a very simple, basic question we ask all of our guests, and that is, how did you become a curator? And I think in your case, it's especially interesting because I know you are also an artist, and you perhaps started working as an artist, and I was wondering about this shift, and perhaps also how artistic practice is still present in your work, or how they are interconnected. If you could tell us about that.
I usually say that I'm an artist working curatorially, and I started saying that maybe in the mid-90s, and that was following perhaps a short period of time, maybe working more collaboratively or working on projects that involved other people. And sometimes that might be working with a fellow student in France, when I studied in France, in Orléans for a year, and collaborated with a French artist, François, on a number of exhibitions. Or it might be working with an organization called Critical Access or Random Access. It had two interchangeable names, which was an organization set up in the early 90s in Dublin, in Ireland, from where I come from. And that was a bunch of artists, activists, curators, people who were certainly looking for art to have a more meaningful relationship with the world and not just take the form of product or things that were to be exhibited. So working with artists and contexts that were placing art in like social welfare offices, in mental health facilities, in outdoor space, but then also thinking about the kind of discursive, critical talking as practice, speaking as practice, listening as practice. And that was very much in the early 90s. And I was very lucky to be a younger member of that bunch of people. So I learned quite a lot from people like Mick Wilson and Martin McCabe, and then later on people like Maeve Connolly, but then also people like Maurice O'Connell and other art. It was a very, very lucky time to be an artist in Dublin, actually. But lucky whatever. But then also I made a lot of work in the early 90s where I collaborated with survivors of sexual abuse, and also worked with issues related to kind of physical and sexual abuse, particularly in an Irish context, but also looking for other conversations happening elsewhere in the United Kingdom, in Canada, in Europe, and so forth. But so I was very much working with groups of people, or trying to find ways to make the work that I was making as an artist maybe more meaningful and more connected to other kind of processes of public, working with kids, working with social workers, working with psychologists, working with people coming from the medical profession, people coming from the legal profession. And I was very young then, so I was quite naive, and I was still in my early 20s. So maybe I wasn't calling it curating then, but it was more like called, I think maybe the dominant term at the time was literal arts or social practice. But terms like participation or social engagement were less kind of common. I mean, the references were people like, John Ahern and Group Material, General Idea, Jenny Holzer, Barbara Kruger, all of those usual people, great people. But I did a fine art degree in Dublin. I did an undergraduate, I did a Bachelor of Fine Arts, and I studied in Dublin. I was born in London. But I had a studio practice for a period of time in the early 90s as well. Shared a studio with artists Jared Byrne and Ronan McRae, very cheap rent in Dublin at the time. And I just knew that I needed to leave. Also, I just knew I needed to leave for a period of time. I knew that the curator opportunities and the teaching opportunities were pretty limited, and then also very hierarchical, and also very, very turgid, and felt a little bit old, maybe. And I did a lot of residencies, like many artists did in the 90s, when there was very little other opportunity. And also residencies came with kind of stipends and accommodation and production funding, and sometimes with publications. And I think maybe I exhausted those opportunities after a few years, and I ended up setting up an organisation called Multiples in Dublin, which was an artist-led initiative where we co-produced and exhibited artist editions and multiples from artists in Ireland and also internationally, everybody from Lawrence Wiener to completely unknown artists. And even in the 90s, Lawrence was perhaps not as well known as he was before he passed away, but he was certainly saying yes to a lot of things that he might not have been able to say yes to when he departed. But so that was also an initiative, and that enabled me to keep a lot of the conversations alive in a way. I think that when you started the preamble before our conversation around the need for connecting with others and talking to other curators and being in conversation, really that was very much part of that shift away from making one's own work into collaborating with other people, other artists, and then also contextualizing the practice in a different way and placing it in conversation or in dialogue with other practices, and then also maybe providing a critical framework for the work that kind of couldn't do on its own in a way. It couldn't pre-exist or whatever. And then also curatorial processes set up these relations. They demand ways of working with others that you can't do it all on your own. And then I think also you start to realize that many artistic practices are ultimately not produced by a single author. They're produced by many, many different authors.
No, but that I think for us that the networked or the collaborative or also the friendship around the practice of curating and working with artists is very important. I think also in now. So you can feel quite lonely sometimes. In a funny way, we started to define ourselves. This is actually kind of a joke. With Eloise, we realized that in our curatorial practice, we have different interests. What draws us to this work? What interests us most? And I would be more of an artist-oriented curator. In a sense, I really enjoy the conversations. I love commissioning new work. I feel it's a process of learning for me, being in conversation with someone. And Eloise is very drawn to artworks and spending time with artworks and contemplating their meaning in different contexts and recontextualizing them and so on. And this is, of course, not a strict line, even though it sounds like we created this dichotomy within the practice. But when looking at your work, or as much as I know of it, it seems like you're almost like a curator-oriented curator. I wonder if that's something you could respond to. Of course, I also know from one perspective your work, and that perspective comes from, when I was at university and I started to be a bit more familiar with the term of curating as something I might want to do, or something that also framed what I've been already doing. And then I wanted to learn more about it. I went to the library, to an arts library, and I went to the shelf about curating, and there were two books. There was this Interviews of Hans Ulrich Obrist with curators, and this other book, The Curator's Egg, which is a lot more about museology than curating, in fact. And I thought, like, who can tell me what I'm doing, or how I should be doing, or what is the contemporary discourse? And I think within your practice, again, as I got to know it, it was very much about excavating what curators are doing in the now, and also talking to people. And I think this collaboration and conversations that you mentioned also in relation to your artistic practice is very much there, and also added this knowledge base, or a kind of creating a ground for where to start from, or creating also a kind of platform for these conversations within curating. So that's how I came up with that. Sorry for labeling that way.
I mean, I imagine there are many different modes of being a curator, or many different models or positions, but I do perhaps agree that there are two dominant methodologies, and one or methods, if you like, more than a methodology, but one is working with works and the other is working with practices. And then there's maybe a third way, which is a combination of the two. And that is also if the outcome of the process that is set in motion by that model or by that method accounts for the exhibition as one of the final outcomes, whatever form the exhibition might take. But things in that one experiences as being on display or being experienced in exhibition. And I probably move between those three different models on a regular basis. I think I went through kind of a number of shifts in my own practice as a curator because of different positions or different contexts in which I was working. I worked in London at London Print Studio as the gallery curator there for 2 to 3 years in the early 2000s when I was at the same time studying in Middlesex University. And it was a kind of in a way, full-time, part-time position. I had responsibility for the whole of the gallery program, exhibition program, but at the same time, my time wasn't being maybe accounted for in terms of like the remuneration or the credit or all of these things. So, but it was a really amazing opportunity, and I had a really great 2 to 3 years. But I set in motion maybe a number of different like thematics or a number of different kind of like curatorial structures to work with. And that enables like quite a lot of like thematic exhibitions, quite a lot of exhibitions with things, where you create an essay, and the essay has a series of illustrations, and these illustrations are artworks, and sometimes those artworks might be the culmination of new works that are produced because you're talking to an artist, and other times it might be existing work. But they're kind of very essayistic, I would say, the exhibitions, but also very much this thematic way of working, coming up with an overall idea, an overall curatorial structure, and then you select works and you orchestrate a particular narrative around those works. So it's kind of storytelling. And then I think I shifted then away from this way of working into more like working with the structures, and the structures then would kind of in a way enable lots of different practices, often in contradiction to one another, often in disagreement with one another, to kind of coexist within the exhibition process, and then coexist within the final exhibition form. And I think that this enabled me to work with a whole range of different artists, and in a way opened up my own limited access to contemporary art into other areas like painting and collage and drawing and mediums that I wouldn't have really maybe engaged with so much as a kind of more thematic essayist curator, which was more trying to find the things which fitted the narrative that you're trying to kind of tell. And then I also, within opening up these structures of engagement and structures of involvement of others, I also was very invested in this idea of the open work or the open structure. So allowing things in that were not very good, or that collapsed, or that failed, or that, and then just allowing them to kind of to be part of the exhibition. And so even though being very self-aware of that, maybe sometimes too self-aware, and then sometimes those things that you allow in then become the most interesting parts of some exhibitions, because they're really like pulling at the edges of the other works. And then I think I shifted away from these open structures into more maybe a combination of those two ways of working, but focusing very much on beginning with a conversation with an artist, a dialogue with an artist. And then I think over time, there are certain artists that I'm very invested in working with often, and then there are other artists I'm maybe invested in working with once. And this is a difference. So there's different kind of paces to those dialogues. Working with an artist once for the first time can take, a different. There's a different strain on the temporality of the process. Whereas if you're working with an artist over and over and over again, there's a kind of a shorthand to that dialogue, and it's maybe possible to do things more quickly together. And then I think the curator of curators idea is, I also, when I lived in France in the 90s for a short period, I met like people like Nicola Borio and Hans Ulrich Obrist and many other curators there, Stephanie Moisden Tremblay and Jerome Sons and Hu Han-ru, and all these people who were living in Paris, or at least passing through Paris at the time. It was a very exciting time to be in France, even though it was very difficult to do anything as a young curator, even a young artist. There was this moment where there were a lot of so-called relational artists, or so-called artists invested in the exhibition as a space that different kinds of relations could be given voice, or given presence, or made present, or questioned, and then also this bunch of artists from Dominic Gonzalez, Forster, Celine Gillick, and Pierre Joseph, and many others, and I felt very much inherited the legacy of like people like Felix Gonzalez Torres and other artists from the 80s, early 90s who were very invested in thinking about the viewer and thinking about the social contract of the experience of art and exhibition. I realized I didn't know very much about the history of exhibitions, and I didn't know very much about curating. And so I was using a language that was very familiar to the field, but also it was a language that I was unclear as to what these words and terms, what they meant. So I started to do a lot of research into the histories of curating, and looking back to the world exhibitions of the 19th century, back to the birth of the museum, the Western Museum, I should say, and so on, and also questions of coloniality, and at the time what was called post-coloniality in the 90s, rather than decoloniality or otherwise. Those terms were not active really for me in the 90s, and then I went into all of the libraries here, there, everywhere, in all parts of the world, and there were 2 or 3 books, if that, sitting on a shelf, which was called Museum Studies. And Museum Studies was also kind of developed in a way in parallel to this shift towards the discursive within curatorial practice, and then also critique of the museums and critiques of power and authority and so forth. And you can see that not only in the shift in conceptual art practices away from the idea towards the social contract, as I should say. So I started interviewing curators because of the lack of publications about curating. There were lots of publications. I mean, there was that Carsten Schubert one, which is kind of still everywhere, the Curator's Egg. But then Carsten Schubert was also doing quite interesting shows, very object-based shows in London at the time and in the early 2000s. And then Hans Ulrich started his interviews project. So it was clear to me that there was a particular kind of knowledge that was emerging, which was one, this critique of the museum, and then secondly, this overemphasis on personal curatorial narratives. So art curators talking about themselves, just as I'm doing maybe now. So there was a kind of a gap, or there was a kind of a gap between those two discourses for me. So one which was very critical, or seemed to be critical of existing structures and existing histories, and the other which was kind of making history, but making history through very kind of dominant, subjective kind of narrative approach, storytelling on behalf of the person who realized the work. So I started interviewing all the people that were being interviewed, and then I started to ask different questions, and maybe also and then I started publishing and writing, not from the perspective of the curator, but from the perspective of someone looking at the curatorial projects of others. And this was not a common thing to do in the early 2000s, certainly not in an Anglophone context. So in a way, like we're curating subjects and curating the educational turn, and a series of essays that I wrote for Art Monthly in the early 2000s, it was kind of a response to that. And not easy. So even with people like with people like Rox Media Collective, who you mentioned earlier, and others, that to ask a curator to write about somebody else was also kind of a new invitation. It wasn't like that people were that curators were automatically doing this. They were writing about artists in catalogue essays. This was another dominant form, and still exists as the dominant form of curatorial writing, or curator writing rather than curatorial writing. And then they were also then taking part in conferences, speaking of themselves and their projects, but they weren't, other than Hans Ulrich, who was doing it in this very interview-oriented way, they weren't exploring the curatorial practices of others, and they weren't critiquing them. So I think this started to become my practice in a way, and then also started to become embedded in the exhibition making practice, and it started to become embedded in how I thought about institutions and how I thought about networked relational practices and so forth.
I have one more question, is more, it's not so much a question, a reflection. I wrote down two words when you were talking about your early curatorial practice, and those are things that fail and collapse. And I've been thinking about this myself for a very long time, and not only as, you mentioned it in relation to curating, that, sometimes artworks would not, how to allow for failure into the exhibition. But I also wonder, I've been thinking about this for myself, like how to allow for failure in curatorial practice. And what does that mean? Also in relation to the professionalization of the field, and also in relation to responsibilities that we hold. Because, what does curatorial, I feel like in curatorial practice, there is very little space for not only allowing for failure, but maybe admitting that for various reasons, but also, it's just in terms of the kind of power structures, monetary structures, and responsibilities that maybe are on you as a curator. Like, how can we talk about failure and collapse within the curatorial? I don't know where this question is going, but I just had to note down these two words.
I think the idea of collapse or failure within some of the exhibition more so the exhibition projects, was very much about thinking about failure not as a kind of an endpoint, but as more like a kind of like threshold of learning or something, or I'm not really comfortable with that. And I don't mean like morally uncomfortable. If I'm morally uncomfortable, that's out. But if it's more, if it's like it doesn't really fit with my kind of taste, or it doesn't really fit with what I was thinking when asking an artist to respond to the invitation, and then just allowing it to, if they're comfortable, are you, you really have to ask that question. Are you truly comfortable with allowing this to be exhibited? And if they are, then you go with that. And I tend to lean, I'm somewhere in between this now, because I feel like I've gone through this process of allowing a lot of things into exhibitions that perhaps I'm still uncomfortable with. Yeah. So, but then there are other things that I've become more comfortable with, like color. Like my shows are very colorful, but in the 90s and 2000s, like they were just like black and white. They were just like pieces of paper stuck to the wall, or they had a different kind of aesthetic, because I was very invested in this conceptual dematerialized exhibition and more about the ideas rather than the form. And I think, I was more interested in kind of like the totality of the exhibition rather than the individual components. I also didn't want to think about trying to speak to those individual components. So I also kind of had a rule for myself that I would not speak about the artworks, that I would only speak about why they were brought together, and really make that decision that artists can speak to their own work in a way. So in making that decision, then you talk about the works or around the works, or you talk in relation to them, or there's a kind of more circuitous relationship with the individual components within the exhibition. But I think also the process of allowing things in that are maybe collapse or uncomfortable with other works was also kind of maybe a self-conscious critique of the curator as an arbiter of taste in a way, but at the same time orchestrating a certain way in which these good and bad objects could coexist together, and be more interested in that rather than the individual good or bad objects. I don't know whether that's articulating it so clearly, but when I started thinking about exhibitions as whole, and that they have different groundings and different planes of interaction and different modes of artistic labor and different modes of artistic practices that respond to the exhibition in different ways. So thinking about the background as that which surrounds you, or thinking about the middle ground as something you interact with, but only partially, like the lighting, the design of the exhibition, the gallery furniture, the floor, the ceiling, all of these things, all of these middle ground activities. And many artists make middle ground works, and then foregrounded works being the kind of objects themselves, or then sometimes, but also sometimes the middle ground becomes the foreground. Like a TV monitor can sometimes be more dominant than the thing which you're experiencing on the monitor, So I was very interested in like, where does the work end? Like does the work end without the technology, or does the work end with the technology? Or, when a painting is not on a canvas, but instead applied to the wall, then is the wall the work, or is the painting the work, or is the paint, why is the paint so important then if the work is the wall? So I think maybe these became very obsessive things to attend to, and then there were so many really great artists that were making work that very much engaged with the architectonics of the exhibition and the architectonics of space more widely. So in a way, often working with the background artists or a core bunch of artists to really define what the exhibition would look like, feel like, how you would think about the viewer in relation to that. And then once that was kind of set in place, certainly with exhibitions like Tonight or Coalesce or La La Land, that lots of other voices, lots of other contradicting practices can kind of enter into those spaces and play with them, or rub up against them, or be in correspondence with them in a way that is a little bit more fluid than trying to select works and giving all the energy to this. I'm also not a kind of a list kind of curator. I can't do this like I have a list of artists and then I have to do it one by one, and then I go, okay, they said yes, that's great, they're going to do that. Now what are we going to do? And maybe they have an idea. Maybe they say, oh, I know this artist. And also, a lot of the projects, certainly before now, have really emerged like this. So an artist would know another artist, or know another artist, and know another artist, or know artists, or know of another artist, and then you allow this kind of, it is friendship, certainly, but I think it's more like allowing just these emotive traces into the process, and sometimes that's a dead end, and sometimes that becomes uncomfortable in the sense that, oh, this is totally there. This does not look like what I was thinking. This is like not a good artist, or this is like, or this is like, really problematic, or they're not in a good headspace at this particular moment. This is not the right time, because time is also a very big part of it. Like sometimes an artist can make so many good works, and then you approach it's just the wrong time, and you immediately know. I mean, I feel like I think I'm instinctual enough now, but I immediately know, oh, this is really not the moment to annoy them. And then other times they're a bit more open, or they have more time, or they have somehow there's a clarity within what they're doing, or there's a playfulness that's maybe needed. So I don't know. It's not so always clear, but I am always thinking of how to mess it up once it starts to look clear in my head, like what it could look like. Then I try to think about ways of messing that up.
And I feel like the invitation is really quite something in your practice, actually. Like I was noticing in Coalesce, like you invited a curatorial duo to then curate within B&B. Yeah, and then how... and I wondered if maybe, like if you could talk more about Coalesce as an exhibition, but then also that sort of invitation of inviting other practices, and then maybe you could talk about para-hosting, which is something that's very important to publics now, because Coalesce, I just want to quickly add, is that like really exciting for myself to see and to get to know more, because like I feel like there's different connections to what we're trying to do at Shimmer, but you've really been working on at the time, I think it was the first show of this was 2005, I think, maybe
early 2000s, yeah. So it's 20 years ago, yeah.
Yeah, so it's like it's very exciting to see also like what is possible with like a durational, like expansive exhibition that also has multiple different lives in different locations. If you could talk about Coalesce in particular, how that came to be and how did it work actually?
It's I mean, as an exhibition model, it's like it's an accumulative exhibition model, which means that it doesn't have a final form in a way. It culminates at certain moments, or it congeals at certain moments, or it coalesces at certain moments. But it's accumulative, so it's about setting something in motion in a way. And it began at London Print Studio Gallery, with three artists, with Eduardo Padilla, Catherine Bohm, and Jaime Gilly. And the original idea was to convert the gallery into an exhibition. So thinking about when does a gallery become an exhibition, and when are those parameters completely like broken down or collapsed in a way. So we converted London Print Studio Gallery into this kind of print. It became a print, three-dimensional print work. And we used the facilities at London Print Studio to print lots of material that were pasted on the wall, given away as posters on the windows and so forth. So we converted the space into this kind of like environment in a way, and then in the happening within the environment, if you want to think about environments and happenings as coexisting, as historically was people coming and just participating in some way by taking the posters away, very Felix and Falla stories again, but then also like sitting around, lounging around. Eduardo Badia had these print works on fabric which people could sit on and so forth. So this was very much about converting a gallery into an exhibition, and then the exhibition becomes an environment within which something happens, but then the happening is not really defined other than when people are there and interacting in some ways. And we agreed at that point when we started the show that we would let's just keep doing it and find ways of doing it differently. And then when the opportunities came up, if three is then four, so me and the three of them, and then if opportunities came up to do this show elsewhere, we would find a way of making it happen. So we ended up getting another invitation to do it in London at Redux, which then had a structure of like 4 weeks. And so I invited 4 different curatorial groups to respond to the environment. So the happening was the opening of the exhibition, but with more artists like Lothar Gotz and Stefan Nikolaev and Oriana Fox and many others. But then we set up the environment, and then we invited other curators in, like Temporary Contemporary, built this very beautiful poker game set, and they curated exhibitions of artists playing poker together. Then there was Sarah Pierce brought people in to interview, like you're doing, like exactly like this, but then she was staying with me in London, and she would just take things from my bookshelves and come into the gallery, and it's very much a gallery, even though it was also an apartment. And then she would ask people to talk about the book that she brought in, and it would usually be a book that she would think that people like Elizabeth Price or Jason Coburn and others, who were some of the people that she invited in to just have a conversation. And then she recorded them, and then they became a work of Sarah's. And then Dave Beach and Mark Hutchinson did a launch of a publication called The First Condition. And so, these, in a way, the exhibition became space for other curatorial initiatives to be in conversation with the environment, the coalescent environment. And then we had some other invitations to do something in Barcelona, and then in Sligo, in Model and Island Art Centre, which I think was perhaps the moment we invited B&B in. And they were doing quite interesting research into what was then, and perhaps still is now, the former Eastern Europe. So they were excavating and working with a lot of artists who were coming from post-Soviet contexts, and looking at the reality of kind of this post-89 generation and this post-89 phenomena within Europe in terms of, everything from the emergence of Europe to border control to a new kind of narrative around nationalism, to Ursula Beeman looking at land rights and migration, to Tajak Pogacar looking at sex trafficking, human trafficking, but also the rights of sex workers. So it was all a very different kind of approach to research in terms of cohabitation or coalescence. So I invited Sophie and Sarah, Sophie Hope and Sarah Carrington, our B&B, Where B&B, and they curated the film program in a way, the cinema program sometimes. And this was kind of integrated into the exhibition and integrated into the middle ground, integrated into the background. And then we also had a lot of screenings of those works. So in a way, it's a very long project. they're maybe going into some of these details is not so helpful, but at the same time, it's, every time the invitation to do something with Coalesce emerges, it's about bringing like additionality, bringing more in, more and more and more and more. What happens when more and more gets brought in? And then when we did it at Smart Project Space in Amsterdam, there was about 88 artists and lots of events and projects and da, da, da. And then this was, heavy. Now, I mean, heavy infrastructure, like, all of these artists that you start working with for a 10-year period, they're now like, they've got gallery representation, or some of them have stopped making art, or some of them are very busy, or so Coalesce also responds to those conditions, that sometimes certain artists are more dominant within Coalesce, and other times they're the certain artists that are a little bit more like not so visible within the structure. And it is accumulative, so everything kind of stays in a way, or a version of something. So it becomes this like archive of itself. It starts to kind of accumulate positions, accumulate practice. It also becomes a site of production. So Sarah's audio recordings that she did in London in 2005, I think it was, and they then end up becoming like a series of works, which are then exhibited on monitors and on headphones and in publications in Smart Project Space. And then Sarah kickstarts a new process where she starts interviewing her students at DAI, Dutch Art Institute, for another project on coalescence and making a video work in collaboration. So the work, it starts to have all of these other things, tentacles, and I'm really interested. And I think I learned that also from Sarah in a way, this idea of the exhibition as a site of production, not a site of production which you see as an experience within the exhibition, but as a space within which certain kinds of production can happen because of the exhibition, not in the exhibition, but can come out of the exhibition. And now, after that show, we just decided that we needed to focus on maybe the archive and looking at the archive. And the archive became, we started with thinking of it not hiring photographers to photograph the show, but that artists would make their own documentation, and then we would accumulate all of this material. And of course, pre-2007, the iPhone is invented in 2007. The digitalization of imagery and digitalization of exhibitions starts to be quite different from 2007. So pre-2007, everything is slides and photographs and transparencies and, this kind of material. Even drawings become a kind of a part of the archive. So we kind of started to accumulate all of that, but then gave up on it. It was such a monster. It's also expensive, and it wasn't, 3 artists hanging out in London Print Studio doing an environment to 88 artists coming from different parts of the world to exhibit together and make new work, a lot of new work. Because it's also a site of production, like Richard Benlett did the entire floor, for example, in Smart. So we realized that it was now kind of into this space of overproduction, and we didn't. This was not what we kind of collectively wanted it to become. But in terms of like the process, like artists have certain parameters that they're asked to work within, or they create their own parameters. And sometimes the compromise or the agonism between works on the walls, or the folding over of like artists wants to put work on top of each other and things like that. That's often a space of negotiation, and sometimes that negotiation goes really well. Yeah. And other times it's very, very uncomfortable, and sometimes it's people falling out. But this falling out or these disagreements we try and process them, and we try and find ways of looking at what is it that's so upsetting? Like, what is it that's so upsetting with another artist being more dominant than their work and so forth? And often I think it comes down to input, it comes down to investment, it comes down to time and financial input. Like, I've spent all this time doing this work, and then somebody comes and just, sprays all over it. and here, and it's that, and it's not, it's, but then but is the work better? Does it look better? And well, it is kind of more interesting, or at least it's like, I wouldn't have done that. There's like, it becomes, the coalescence or the cohabitation becomes different.
But also, like, I think the kind of negotiation or conversation between the artists on how their works actually intervene or come into dialogue or whatever is really interesting. Like, that is something that I think a lot about with Shimmer, but also, like, what I understand with Coalesce is that actually nothing leaves, actually. Like, everything, the things enter, and then at the end of the exhibition period, everything leaves together. Is that right?
The background, the middle ground, because it's either site responsive or it's infrastructure to show other works. That all, it gets recycled. Basically, it's all recycled back into becoming the infrastructure for other works, or it's recycled. And then the works which are foregrounded works, so works that arrive in the gallery as artworks and cannot be altered by the process of exhibition or being exhibited, they leave, and then they go back to the artists. But there are very few foreground works in Coalesce, or there have been very few works in Coalesce that are of that nature. So they're often works that are incorporated or built into the exhibition environment, or they are film works which, they just exist as files, or if they're like a series of small paintings by William McKeown, for example, they went back to the artists at the time. And so there's very few works like that. In a way, it's not this, like, the transport costs for Coalesce are quite small, even though the show is very big. So it's also, it enables, because a lot of the work, a lot of the labor, a lot of the is the presence of artists working with each other, and sometimes or sometimes there's a schedule, where Eloise comes in for 2 days and does their thing, and then Kris comes in and does their thing, and then it's, and then someone comes in and goes, oh no, that I can't do my thing, so I have to do something else. But we usually have something very, very, there is a plan, and the plan has been agreed upon, and then some people are like, so, very busy, so they can't commit so much, and other people have time, and they have 2 weeks to install. You go, okay, well, you've got 2 weeks. Let's take over like 10 walls or something, but it does accumulate artists and accumulates works, but then sometimes it's maybe not possible to show everything and so forth.
So also what I find really interesting looking at your work is that also there are often artworks that return in different exhibitions, like Eduardo Padala's sleeping bag, I noticed. And I was wondering if you could talk about that in particular, because, I like that, from what I imagine, is that this work is not yet finished for you in a way, like there's still work to be done to get to know this work, or what can the work do for different exhibitions. And I think sometimes it feels as curators that, like, maybe it's okay to work with the same artist for other shows, but no, you not necessarily can you show the same work in different contexts. And I really love that this particular work, actually, also the work itself, but also what you're doing with it. And could you say something about that?
Eduardo's sleeping bags have been shown in, I think, all of the Coalesces, and they are, in a way, the most pragmatic middle grounds, because they can be rolled up, they're soft, and then they can be rolled out, and they're sculptural, so they can occupy space in so many different ways. They're also incredibly beautiful when you come in contact with them, and when you feel them, and you see that they're made up of different materials, and they also have these texts which are stitched into them. So they're, I don't know, there's always like something new to experience with them. And then also people behave differently with them. People get inside them, people sit inside them, people push them, people roll them up. I like that they have this kind of continuation of like Lygia Clark or Lygia Pape kind of vibe to them, and Eduardo is very much in dialogue with those artists, and Pedro Otachica and others, and so in a way there are a number of reasons he often. But then with We Are the Centre in Bard at college, when I curated that show, there's a lot of windows in the museum, the Hessel Museum, a lot of windows, which it's quite a bright part of the world, upstate New York. So I kind of wanted to filter the light, or something that filtered the light, so that the light and the seasons would become, in a way, part of the exhibition. But by just allowing the light in wasn't really a sufficient way of doing that. So we commissioned Eduardo to maybe design a kind of works out of this kind of netting material that would filter the light, and that the light and the colours of the netting would enter the exhibition and become part of that. And then we had a piece with Volker Pisano, which was a critique of Scelida sculptures, that was installed in front of a Franz West sculpture. And so in a way they're like they're kind of somewhat weird, strange binary, non-binary kind of juxtaposition. And Eduardo proposed to have the sleeping bags there as a way of like sitting with these two sculptures. So they kind of returned because he asked, and it wasn't that I invited those specific works back in. And I again, this is this space of collapse. Like we had already asked Mary Heilman for a lend of some of her Sunnyside chairs to be part of the show. So there was already some middle ground works that were going to be quite dominant. And then Yasmina Sibic had designed her own kind of like seating sculptures. So there were works already that had this kind of middle ground aspect to them in We Are the Centre. So Eduardo's was just in a way another middle ground. And they also have this very kind of poetic relationship in that show with William McKeown's wallpaper work, the Cuckoo wallpaper work, and also 3 of William's paintings. And William was alive when Eduardo's sleeping bags and his small paintings were shown together in Sligo. And there's some great documentation of William kind of like Willie installing his paintings next to the Lawrence Wiener happenstance with all due intent wall text, and then Eduardo's sleeping bag sitting on the floor. So there's something quite poetic. William's no longer with us, and he no longer alive, and I was quite interested in maybe bringing them back together again somehow. William and Eduardo, who are both kind of looking at queer abstraction in different ways in their work. So I quite liked, we talked about having these like 2 queer bodies kind of coming back together again, but in a different context. So somehow this was kind of also part of the more emotive side of the thinking. So Eduardo's sleeping bags, the exact sleeping bags that were in Sligo 10 years previously, were shown alongside William's paintings in upstate New York exactly 10 years later, and one of them is alive and one of them's not alive. And they're also a different dynamic within that relationship. And then also certainly my thinking around William's work and also my thinking around Eduardo's work has changed quite a lot and has been transformed by working with the material and working with them as artists. And I think what Eduardo's sleeping bags and also his practice more widely does is that it really brings out this kind of distinction between the work when it's just artwork and the work when it's exhibited, and how the work in exhibition completely transforms everything else around it, but also that the object itself, the thing itself, becomes transformed and transformative. So yeah, and then there are certain works that kind of pop up every now and then within the across exhibitions. Not so often, but it does happen, and I'm quite open to that. And if something works in one exhibition, why wouldn't it work in another exhibition? And then also it takes for me like I don't know, maybe similar to Shimmer, knowing the great work that you do. It's I really have to know something quite well to work with it. I have to kind of I have to know what I feel about it, and even my feelings are I have no idea how I feel. That's also enough. But I have to have there has to be something. I have to have done a little bit of work beforehand, research, go deep, think about it a lot, look at it hard, look at it differently, spend a lot of time with it before I'm comfortable enough to show it or exhibit it or be in conversation with it. So in a way, the return of old friends with, say, Eduardo sleeping bags, or the return of old friends such as Williams paintings, are like kind of a familiarity, but they're also, the exhibition allows for kind of new thinking and having it going on another dates together.
Yeah. No, I totally appreciate that. I think it's also what makes exhibition making so exciting. I think to be able to revisit old friends in different spaces, and also like I also what I liked. I mean, I didn't see the exhibition We Are the Centre, but I've seen the documentation. Is the actually that particular view of Volker Pisano's work and then the Franz West sculptures, and I could imagine myself in that environment, kind of like the backgrounding, foregrounding that you're talking about in many of your exhibitions. So the Franz West sculpture is outside of the exhibition. Like you have to look at through a window, through the sort of filtering.
Eduardo's curtains.
Yeah, I love that, and I also like it's really nice to also like really spend time with your work actually, to then also see like, oh well, the background, middle ground, foregrounding that you're interested in, it like comes in all your shows in different ways, and how like as an audience, because I often like to pretend to be the audience in my exhibitions, like, you know, like practice, you know, think about sight lines and how would my body feel if I was in the show. And I do that when I'm looking at other exhibitions, and I get really excited. But what's the point of bringing the audience up? Yeah, the audience. I would love to talk a bit about Publix actually, because you've mentioned like viewership and audience, and Publix is your current. I mean, I notice on your website that it's it's considered a project, but you wouldn't call Publix a project, right? Like this is would you call it an organization or an institution? Like it's a library. It's it has a resource. It's many different things.
I mean, Publix is a curatorial project. In a way, calling it a curatorial project allows it to fail. Allows it to collapse. So, you know, also emphasizing that maybe it won't be around forever. It won't last forever. Curatorial projects, even if they're cumulative and durational and evolving, sometimes they have rest moments, or sometimes they go away for a while and so forth. So in a way, it is a curatorial project that tries to bring different publics, different audiences, different modes of participation together over time. So both imaginary and real publics. So I'm very interested in how the exhibition does that, you know, that the strangers and the so-called general audience, or people that are being entertained or wanting to be entertained, but then might have a different experience, coexist with publics that have a relationship with the work or are invested in the field of artistic production and so forth. So I'm very interested in that, but I'm also interested in how, when having different audiences and different publics for different events or different moments, that it creates a different kind of effort, a different kind of like space of attention every time, because you can't assume anything. You can't assume that we're all speaking to the same kind of like queer feminist agenda and when we're using those terms, for example. But also it is an organization. I mean, Publix is an organization. It has currently 3 full-time members of staff, and it has 2 paid interns, for want of a better term, but I think they're more like, we have a librarian who's one of our interns, is now our librarian, was an intern, now is our librarian, and doing great work with the library, and very invested in activating the library now that we can post COVID, or well, post COVID, whatever moment we're at in relation to the pandemic. But so people can gather, and people can use the books, and people can gather to read together, and so that's very active part of our organization. And then we spend a lot of time mapping out what we would do across a whole year, so in a way organizing our time in relation to our publics and in relation to our existing strands of our program. And then we also spend a lot of time as an organization fundraising and trying to establish new partners, try to kind of maintain old partners, old relationships, networks, and so forth. So this is also part of us as an organization. And then we're also an organization that kind of wants to become an institution. We're very invested in instituting, and that means kind of growth. That means being able to grow a little bit. I'm not sure currently whether it's yet possible to do that economically, structurally, in terms of the context we are currently in Finland, in Helsinki, in the Baltic region, and so forth. I'm not sure if it's completely possible to grow, but we're trying, and we have been pushing that. So we have grown from, having 1 funder to now having maybe 6 funders, then having maintained 2 full-time members of staff, to mostly 2 a year interns, plus now a 3rd curator of learning. So we're also invested in working with what we're calling Publix Youth, which would also become part of our advisory board and so forth. We also have a board structure. So we have 6 to 8 members of our board that are also helping us develop the organization into an institution. And, becoming an institution is maybe, it's important that, as an organization, if the organization falls apart, then what's left behind? And if the organization, kind of unravels or disintegrates or goes into becomes part of other organizations, this is also fine. But then what does that organization leave behind in terms of the institution? So it would be really important for me, although not knowing whether it's yet possible, to be able to hand over Publix to someone else to do something else with it, with the curatorial project, completely different maybe. This is the shift from organization to institution that is perhaps very difficult within the current context, financially, economically, socially, and so forth. But it is a desire of ours. And then with the para hosting program, we, as an organization, try to have some flexibility in our schedules and in our resources to allow for spaces for other organizations to enter into our program, and that we would support those other organizations to realize certain projects or events, and that we would treat them equally as our own. That we don't own them, but we treat them very much as part of our program. There is no hierarchy. They're not like lesser or more than our program. And then it also brings in different publics. Then it also brings in different curatorial ideas, some of which may be lesser or more important to us. And then it also, it's a little bit like a residential model of curating. Like you end up spending time with people for a short period of time or longer period of times. Like with Shimmer, you were on our mind for over a year. And just being on your mind is sometimes maybe enough. And we just started last week with Latitudes in Barcelona, and they came here with Laia Estrup, who did a performance, and that's kickstarting a process of hoping to do a number of different things with them as part of our program. And in this case, and like with Shimmer, we kind of seed fund, or we'd find a way of like seed funding the project, and then looking at what the parameters are, and start a moment of like being in dialogue and proposing together. But I think that the para hosting, in terms of like curatorial projects which have their lifespan, I think it's been a really great testing ground for the parameters of what we can do as an organization and what we allow ourselves to be in conversation with. But I also think that it places quite a strain on the organization financially, and then also in terms of our labor and our time and our abilities to move from being with one group to being with another group, or to being, it's quite, it kind of takes its toll. And then also there are different expectations which different para guests have, and we also have to be careful in a way to look after ourselves and to look after the organization that we have, built together, and also that we've inherited from Checkpoint Helsinki, which is the organization that we took on and became Publics, that myself and Elisa Savanto kind of have been developing as Publics. But I think, like, I think para hosting is a kind of a way of critiquing care as the kind of dominant term to define what being together is. And in a way, it's introducing other approaches to being together, like being together with strangers, or what is it that's lacking? What is it that's not taking place that should be taking place? What can't you do at this particular moment that you want to do? Like, what are the gaps in possibilities? And this is a different way of thinking about looking after and being with others than taking care because it's something that you feel like needs attention and needs affection and needs protection and so forth. So in a way, para hosting is not so much about caring. It's really about hosting. It's about hosting whoever comes in the door. And sometimes you might not care for those people or their ideas, but you can still host them, and you can still spend time together and look after and attend to each other. But it has to be reciprocal. And self-care is not reciprocal. Self-care is about the individual and about making sure that the boundaries are very clear between you and me. And para hosting is not that. Para hosting is much more messy, and it's much more entangled. And in a way, it's not always that, like, it can be so like amicable and friendly, like with Shimmer and Publics. There was a kind of really cozy synergy, which began with, our both of us wanting to work with Gordon Hall and bring Gordon to Europe and so forth, and show Gordon's work and spend time with Gordon. And then Gordon became an excuse for us to spend time together, and so on and so forth. So this is also, this is not about caring for ourselves in this process. It's about like opening it out to what could we do with Gordon and what would Gordon want to do with us and so forth. So I think para hosting is also a critique of self-care. So when people have, or when organizations have expectations to be hosted, to be para hosted, that doesn't fit with this idea of reciprocity or dialogue or messiness, then it starts to question why we're doing it in the first place. When people just want the space, or people just want the resources, or they're not thinking of us when approaching Publics to be part of the para hosting program. They're not thinking about why Publics. They've never been here, but they want to do something at Public. Well, why do you, like, they've never spent time with us. They like all of these basic kind of, I don't know, like methodologies start to come into question. So I think we're a little bit at that moment where we're asking ourselves, what works with para-hosting and what doesn't work, and is it a question of translatability, or is it a question of it's run its course, or do we do less para-hosting, and maybe it's now become a more integral part of everything we do, rather than it being something that's somehow separate to what we do.
In the next episode, we interview Zipporah Elders, with whom we delve into the personal and imaginative realm of curating and her approach to navigating institutions.
If you have feedback, we'd love to receive your email at ihopethismessagefindsyouwell@gmail.com. You can also follow us on Instagram at ihopethismessage and find us on SoundCloud under the same handle. Our jingle was by the artist duo Momo No Ez, and our sound engineer is always Nick Thomas.
I hope this message finds you well.